Please do not make these mistakes while building with server actions. To be fully candid with you, I've been really loving building with server actions inside of Next.js, and I love it because my backend code now lives with my frontend, and overall, my development time has drastically reduced. Provided you don't make these mistakes that I'm going to cover in this specific video. Because if you're not careful, you will waste a lot of time. So in this specific video, I'm going to cover a few mistakes I've made so you can learn from them, and also a few gotchas with server actions and Next.js. So let's waste no time and let's get started. So I've built this fun little app for us called as Stockorama. This allows you to view your inventory in the warehouse. You also are able to add to that warehouse whatever items that you do have and keep stock of them. Eventually, we will also add a functionality to add likes to the specific item so that you can say that, hey, this is a very popular item. Let's keep it. This is not so much. Let's get rid of it. So, for example, this specific app, Stockorama, has a simple form where you can add your product name as well as your product quantity. For example, if I add the product name Chemex Coffee, and let's say I have 20 of those. Now, if you know me, you know that I love coffee. So Chemex is definitely what I use daily. So I'm going to say I have 20 of those. Let's hit add. Now, the minute we do that, you can see that this specific message, data written successfully log, gets printed onto the console. And we also have a file called as inventory.json. You can imagine that this specific file is like your database, for example. So in inventory.json, you will now see that we have two items, red sweater, which I had already added, and also Chemex coffee that we just added. So what it does is it's going to write to this specific file anytime we add a item inside our inventory. Similarly, now we are on slash products. If you go to slash products slash view, then it's another page where you can view all the items in your warehouse. For example, now we already had red sweater, and now we added Chemex coffee with a quantity of 20. So it is a very simple application that we will be using to learn server actions in Next.js further. Let's walk you through the code of the app that we are continuing to build further. So, for example, we are using the Next.js app router. If we go to the app directory and products folder, because right now we are on slash products route, let's go to page.tsx, which is essentially the default route for products. So, in this case, we have a pretty straightforward form that we see on the right hand side. For example, we have the heading inventory. We are displaying any validation error messages to the user. Let's say user were not to enter anything here and click add, then you can see that it says missing fields, failed to create inventory. At the same time, some validation messages as well, so that we don't accidentally enter garbage data to our JSON file. So, for example, all the way at the bottom, we have a button. So, based on the state pending, we show the text adding if it's in progress, or add if it's successful. So, for that, we are using a hook called as use form status, and we will take a look at that later. But before that, let's walk you through the server action that we have created here. Now, in this specific action, server action, so first, what this action does is that it uses a library called as Zod, that essentially is a TypeScript runtime library that allows you to safely parse your form fields and display any errors to the user. This is the schema for our form, where I'm saying that the minimum character needs to be 1 and the maximum 18. Similarly, for quantity, minimum should be 1 and maximum 100. Now I'm making sure that I can validate it, and dot library either gives us a success or it gives us a not success error, which that means it gives us a failure. So in that case, if there is an error, then we are showing that to the user, just like you saw, missing fields, failed to create inventory, which is exactly the error we show here because there was an error. But at the same time, if it is successful, then we are writing it to a file called as inventory.json inside our storage folder. Now, if we go to our store data init function, then all we are doing is we're incrementing the count and then we are parsing the existing data and appending to the JSON file and eventually writing it. And we are using fs slash promises, which is already a default built-in library that we have inside of our environment. So we are using the read file and write file functions from that. Now this is a pretty straightforward server action where this specific action parses the data, then it stores the data inside of our JSON file if everything is successful, and then eventually redirects the user. Now, if you want access to any of the links that I've mentioned in this specific video, such as our developer environment code sandbox links, then check the link in the description below. So now we are using this specific React hook called as use form status. The use form status is a pretty straightforward hook. It will give you the status information of your last form submission. So for example, it will give you a property called as pending to showcase if a button is pending or not pending. For in our case, we want to show the pending status anytime we click on add. So it shows adding, and then so if not, then it doesn't show that. But despite using pending over here, and then at the bottom we also have a button which displays the status pending, and we also have this ternary operator which says if it's pending then add, show the text adding, else add. Despite that, it still doesn't show up. So let's take a look at an example. So right now, let's just say that I have smart suites, and let's say I have 70 of those, for example. Now the minute I click on add, the errors go away, data request is successful, but they don't even show pending, for example. And well, that's because this needs to be a child of a form. It cannot be in the same function. So what they recommend in the docs is that you need to make sure that it must be defined as a child of the form element. And what they recommend is to basically create a new function altogether just for the button, and then at the bottom declare that specific button. Now this is a little annoying because just to show the button we really need to create a separate component altogether. But this was one of the mistakes I made. No idea why the status wouldn't change either. So let's just fix our error. For example, if I copy this and then go inside of our home and let's just paste it here. Now use form status is already imported, so we don't need it. But let's just move the button from the bottom all the way to the top here. If it's pending, then it's adding or not. Let's also make sure that we have disabled as pending. At the same time, we have a ARIA disabled property as well, which is for our screen readers to know that this specific button is deactivated. Now, if we go all the way to the bottom where we had the button, let's make sure we call submit button as they show us inside the docs. So the minute we do that, our add button is back. Now let's watch what happens. For example's sake, let's just click on add. You can see that the status changed to from adding. And then now if we head over to inventory.json, you can see now that Smart Suites is in fact available inside of our file, inside of our JSON file, which is pretty awesome. And we are able to show the status as well. But this is something that you definitely need to know, that you cannot necessarily just add the button in the same form, and you need to extract it out with so that you can invoke use form status, and so that use form status can be a child of the form, for example. Just a quick little thing, I also write a weekly newsletter called as Frontend Snacks, where I share useful tips just like what I'm sharing in this specific video. So if you're interested, then check out the link in the description below or go to frontendsnacks.dev for signing up to my newsletter. All right, back to the video. Now, let's say we enter a brand new product inside of our warehouse. For example, I'm just going to say lip balm. And for lip balm, I'm going to say I have 3 lip balm, and let's just hit add. Now you can see that the status has changed from add to adding, but it hasn't redirected us to a new page, despite us redirecting it to slash product slash view. And if we go head to slash product slash view, That route definitely exists with all of this information. And the lip balm that we added also exists as an item in our warehouse. So, why is it that this specific redirect does not work? Now, this is another gotcha you really need to know about Next.js server action. It also says in the docs, but it's a very sneaky one. Redirect needs to be called outside of the try catch block. Now, watch what happens. What we would likely do is after we write to the database, then we would redirect the user or not do this at all and basically do this, for example. Now, let's see what happens. Now, again, let's enter lip balm and we can clean up our warehouse later on. But let's hit add. You can see we get an error failed to create inventory because there is actually an error inside of our dev console. Now, if you can see that this is a next redirect error with no specific information, so you have no idea why this specific error occurred. But if you go to the documentation, you will see that redirect needs to be called outside of the try catch block. That means it will not work inside of a try catch block, it has to be called outside. Then in that case, if I click on adding, you can see now we have successfully been redirected. Definitely took me some time to figure out because the inclination would be to call redirect right after a specific function. For example, in our case, we are storing the data inside of our JSON file. At the same time, and it could also be confusing because we want to make sure we do return some sort of a success message or something like that to the user if we want to show something. For example, the inclination would be that we return a success type and with the message data is returned successfully, just like we return a error type or we return a validation errors here. So the inclination would be that, but because redirect essentially returns it, we don't necessarily need to do that, and redirect itself would work as expected because here an early return does not make sense anymore. So that's how you can redirect a user from one page to the other. Next.js caches everything possible to make our life easy, but it also can make our lives really difficult if you don't know how that caching works internally. And although you don't necessarily need to know each and every detail internally of how the caching works, you still need to know caching at a high level to understand if you get into a weird scenario that you don't know why this data is stale, even though you're doing everything correct. So, for example, if we head over to the docs, here it gives you a high level overview of different caching mechanisms inside of Next.js and their purpose. For example, request memoization. So, for example, this is done on the server side, but it does happen in terms of in a React componentry. And we might have heard of this before from the React world of things, where we can memoize things using use memo, use callback, and so on. But on the Next.js side of things, there's also a data cache where it will store data across user requests and deployment. And again, we can purge the specific data cache. If you typically use fetch inside of Next.js, then it gives you a bunch of different mechanisms to do that. And I love that specific one. But there's also full route cache where, in order to reduce the rendering cost and improve performance, it also basically has caching for a route cache, also a router cache as well, so it can reduce server requests on navigation and so on. Again, this is user session or time based. Now, all these different caching mechanisms would mean that you need to know when exactly to purge the cache, or when to tell Next.js that, hey, I have new data, I know what I'm doing, let's just get rid of this cache that you have. And because I have some new data coming in and I want to show a new state to the user. So, for example, in our application onto the view page, right now we are displaying the list of items in the warehouse alongside name and quantity. Now, I have added another button here called as the like button. Now, depending on the likes from the user, we want to then click on the button and then like it, and it should show a like count here. At the same time, we want to write to our file as well, which is our inventory.json file. So for example, right now likes is 0. So the changes that I've made so far is in our cart action, in the add product action, we call this function called as store data init. If we go to that specific file, then right now we also have added a new property called as likes. And we also have another handy function now called as update likes. What this does is it updates and increments the like count by 1 by reading existing data, provided we pass the ID to it. So for example, in our inventory.json, this ID is a unique ID, and then that is what we are using to increment the count. So for that, we have a brand new action called as the increments like action. Now, this is a server action as well. What this does is that it will again get the ID for the specific element and then invoke update likes with that specific ID. As simple as that. Now, as straightforward as that. Now, this is a brand new server action that did not exist before. So I've already created it for us. But now the gotcha here is that now let's say we want to invoke the specific button. So this is not necessarily a typical form. For example, it doesn't have input fields or whatever, but it does have a button. So that means we can invoke the specific server action as intended. So for example, if we head over to our view page, now we have a button called as a like button where we basically get the likes from our inventory.json. And here we are just displaying any this we are displaying all the database values, all our storage JSON values, all our inventory values here. So what we're doing is we're basically retrieving that and directly passing it in here inside our like button alongside the ID as well from our store. Now, from our store as we loop through all the stores from our database. So, for example, if we go to the like button, right now it is a very simple button with some styling next to it. So, if we want to go ahead and add the functionality to increment the server action, we easily can. Now, what we could do is we could say here, await increment likes action, and likes action takes an ID. So let's just pass an ID here. And this makes it an async function. We have imported the action. We are incrementing the like, for example. Now let's just go ahead and click on the button. Now the data has been successfully updated. That means the like count of 0 should increment by 1. So for example, if we go to our inventory.json, now like is 1. Now, let's do the same. Let's click 2 more times. And now, if we click on inventory.json, the like count is 3 now. That means our action works as intended, and so on. But we also want to show the state of likes onto the page. So, for that, what we could do is we could add another span and then give it some sort of a value here. Now, we are just going to say, let's just display the likes. Now we are already passing the likes from the view page. So what we could do is we could just display them here. Alrighty. So now let's refresh the page. And now the view count is 3, which does get displayed next to the likes, which is awesome. If I refresh it again, it still works. But now if I click on, this is where the gotcha is for Next.js server actions. Let's say I increment it. This specific value stays the same. So we need to do something so that this value gets updated. That's where the React hook use optimistic comes in handy, where we are optimistically saying that, hey, please update the UI because we are confident that this specific request is going to be successful. But if it isn't, then we need to handle it as well. So use optimistic allows us to do that. So what we could do now is we could use the use optimistic hook here and invoke the action. So now let's just take a look at an example. So we can just copy this entire thing and then paste it here, which is with use optimistic. And let's just import it from React. Now, in terms of our state, now in terms of our state, what we want is a like count and also a sending property, which is going to be false by default. So what we are going to say is by default, just show whatever likes you have, but then update it the minute user clicks on and update it the minute the user invokes the server action, for example. So here, so here we can say current state and the optimistic value is going to be likes. The optimistic value is going to be new like count that we have, and this like count is going to be a number. Now watch what happens here. Now this acts as a reducer. So we are updating the like count. So we are basically giving the illusion to the user that hey, the like count has been updated. It's kind of like storing a value inside of use state, and then incrementing the value for use state by +1, for example. So that's similarly we're doing the same thing here. So what we could do is we could just return the state, which would be current state here. We are returning the current state, but we're also incrementing the count now. So we can say the likes is going to be the new like count, and then sending is going to be true. All right, so now we have merged the states with an optimistic value. Now, here what we could do is before it increments, let's just optimistically update it. So add optimistic, which is the function here, and then increment it by 1. So we could say optimistic state dot likes, because we already have access to the states plus 1. So we are incrementing the state and giving it, we're calling it in add optimistic. Now, instead of using likes now, we can just use optimistic state dot likes. And you can think of use optimistic as use state where we are storing the values. So by default, the value is going to be likes. So now if we refresh the page again and give it a shot, let's see what happens. The minute we click on +5, you can see that it increments and it goes back to the exact same value. It works, but then it goes back to the same value. So now if we open up the developer console over here, you can see that there is a warning that to an optimistic state update occurred outside a transition or action. To fix this, move the update to an action or rapid start transition. So again, this is one of those things where there are so many things going on in the React world. We would just use state to increment the value, and then based or use a use reducer or use context to basically increment the value, and then or essentially use a reducer to increment the value, store the state, and then if there's an error, then decrement the count, and so on. But with Next.js or with React, the new React, now we have these new hooks that we can use to optimistically show the state to the UI. But if you start using them, then you get into this rabbit hole and different errors that you might get, which might make you wonder if you're doing something incorrect. So I want to show you like step by step the errors as well that we get, and also how you can solve them so that you can build better applications with Next.js. So, for example, here we do get an error here for updating the state. Now, let's use start transition to update it. So, we could use start transition here. Now, if you look at what use transition does, so use transition is a hook that allows you to update the state without necessarily blocking the UI. And then it's going to be really useful for us. So it's not going to freeze the frame for the user, but in fact it's going to update the state automatically, that specific state individually. So what we could do is we could use start transition here. But I want to give you a heads up that it still is not going to fix it, because this is great, because for using use optimistic we need to use start transition so that it doesn't block the UI. But then there is one more problem that we will get to in a second. But first, let's implement start transition. Let's implement use transition. So here, let's just say pending and then start transition. And then let's use transition. Now we need to wrap this entire function with use transition. Here we could say, whoops, start transition, invoke this entire thing in start transition. Now, this looks quite ugly, but that's the only way we can implement non blocking the UI. So, for example, if we refresh the page, now if we click on heart sign, again, the problem doesn't go away, but the warning does go away. That means we're not going to block the UI when the state finally updates. So, another reason why this specific state does not update is because of caching, like we talked about. So, for example, inside of server action, we can basically tell Next.js that, hey, we have now new data and we need to invalidate the cache after an update occurs. So for that, we need to use a new function called as revalidate path. Now, if we head over to the documentation and go to revalidate data, it says over here you can revalidate the next cache inside of your server actions with revalidate API, with revalidate path API. And if we open up next cache, then it gives you a whole overview of caching that we looked at earlier. So here, let's just call revalidate path, and revalidate path comes from next cache. Keep this in mind because sometimes functions can get imported from different weird imports. So make sure you know this. Make sure your import is correct. So here we are going to say, let's just get rid of the cache. Let's just purge the cache on this specific route products view. Now, if we refresh the page, now let's see what happens. Now, what we are saying is revalidate path, just purge the cache. If we click on 7, look at that. 7 count does get incremented. Similarly, 8 also gets incremented. Now we can close this. And now this is one of those gotchas with Next.js and server actions that was really hard to debug because you keep getting warning on error after error, and it can get really confusing when you're implementing a brand new technology, a brand new functionality within Next.js. So I really hope you got a good understanding of this. So let's add one more item now. So if you go back to home, and here let's just add a brand new item such as water bottle. And now let's just say I have 50 of those, hit add. It changes to adding, and now we have another item with water bottle of like count 0 with quantity 50. And I do like my water bottle. So if I click on plus 4 times, now if we click on inventory.json, we do have like count of 4, which is as expected. Now, lastly, if you do want to show that this specific like count is in fact in progress, so inside of the like button, right now, instead of just showing the likes, we could just say we have another state called as sending that we have added here. And we do add sending as true over here as well. So we can say optimistic state dot sending. If it's true, then maybe let's just say sending and a wave. Otherwise, it's just optimistic likes. Now, if we see what happens now, if I click on plus, you can see that sending state does get updated. Then the state changes. Sending and then the state changes. This is another thing that you could do to show the different states as the action is in progress to the user. Thank you so much for checking out all my videos. If you want me to create specific videos for you, then please comment below and let me know. I respond to each and every comment that I do get on my videos. You must have seen that already. So please comment below and let me know what is it that you would love to learn and if there are any struggles that you are experiencing and so on. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.